Thanks so much, everyone, for watching. We've got an epic lineup tonight of speakers. We've got an awesome panel here. Amazing group of functional doctors, technology, activists, for a leap forward in medicine.
You know, our goal is to make it easy for practitioners to learn in community.
This ecosystem that is being set up by the meetup groups, we believe will be the future ecosystem of this evolved primary care network, and it all revolves around you.
Welcome to the Functional Forum. Thanks for joining us in the charge to accelerate the evolution of medicine. Please welcome your host, James Maskell.
This is the May 2021 Functional Forum. We are going to be talking about reinventing medicine, and ultimately we had some great content. Last year we had done an event with the same speakers, and it was about a month into the pandemic. It ended up being so prescient about where the pandemic would go. Felt like we should get the band back together. And so what you're going to hear tonight is some of that. But before we get into it, I wanted to just share that, this week I spoke about the fact that, really, if we're gonna transform healthcare, we want to actually reinvent medicine. The only way to challenge the power that exists, the power structures that exist in medicine, is to do it collectively. And the thing that I'm most proud of with the Functional Forum is actually building communities of practitioners. And so we are kicking off the second iteration of our meetups. We're not going to be calling them meetups anymore. To find out what we're going to be calling them, you can join us on next month's Functional Forum on June the 7th. But we are going to shoot that forum live in Austin, Texas, on the 25th of May. So if you or if anyone you know is in Austin, Texas, we still have tickets. You can find tickets on Eventbrite, and we're going to be doing it live. We're going to be hearing from 10 practitioners, functional medicine leaders, talking about their interpretation of the reinvention of medicine and the reinvention of their niches within medicine. So please join us for that. All right, so first things first, tonight we are going to hear from Dr. Jeffrey Bland. Most of you guys, I'm sure, know of Dr. Bland by now, but one of the things I most appreciate and acknowledge about Dr. Bland is his ability to synthesize large amounts of information and draw it down into something that everyone can understand. And this year, a lot of information came out. And so for our first speech tonight, we've got Dr. Jeffrey Bland doing sort of a synthesis of a year's worth of data. Enjoy.
So there are 3 papers that were published in the last year that I think help to define the progress and the evolution of our system. The first is the paper that appeared in JAMA Network that you're probably familiar with, the results of the functional medicine model when compared to that of a traditional standard of care family practice model. This was the Cleveland Clinic study that was published a little over a year ago. That indicated that the functional medicine model of care in the Cleveland Clinic setting, when compared to their inpatient family practice center, produced improved outcomes based upon PROMIS outcome variables, the patient-reported information outcome survey-based data. So this was the first really, I think, what called semi-quantitative study showing that the functional medicine model in chronically ill people with complex etiologies has a very significant benefit. Then this is followed up with a more recent paper that many of you may be familiar with, again coming out of the Cleveland Clinic Center, the Functional Medicine Center at the Cleveland Clinic, the impact of functional medicine on patient-reported outcomes. This is looking at inflammatory arthritis, and a retrospective study, again based on PROMIS Global Physical Health and Pain scores. And I think this was another very encouraging bit of data because it again showed a very significant improvement in range of functions in patients with various forms of autoimmune disease utilizing the functional medicine system that was multiphasic and multi-parameter in intervention. And then the most recent study, and one that I think James Maskell will be talking about in more detail, is this paper that was just published in British Medical Journal, looking at patient outcomes and costs associated with the functional medicine intervention in this group visit or shared visit motif or system, in which it was not just one-on-one, but it was based on a group visit, shared visit type of intervention, showing significant cost savings, but also showing significant improvement in patient outcomes. So all of these, I think, are indicative of this increasing understanding that there are new models that are available for managing the complexity of the kinds of situations that we're witnessing as either presaging to a viral infection or as a consequence of conditions that occur post-viral, like the long COVID. So this led me into authoring a series of papers over this last year that I hope started to kind of chronicle some of the things that are happening on the research front that can be translated into the clinic that would make immunology both personal and selective for the individual. The first was this article entitled Age-Related Diseases, A Revolution is Coming, in which I talked about the new kinds of tools that are being used for evaluating the damage or alteration or mutations in the genes of our immune system that lead to what is called clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate potential, or CHIPs. These are injuries that occur that become clonally reproduced in our immune system that then trigger a person into a state of inflammation, chronic inflammation. And for the first time, this is starting to be seen as a risk factor, not just in myelodysplastic diseases like blood-borne cancers, but also a risk factor to virtually all the chronic related illnesses, including atherosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, dementia, and arthritis. So we're starting to recognize that injuries to the immune system that can actually be codified through diagnostic screening can actually encourage the accumulation of damage to the immune system that produces an increasing risk to all sorts of chronic diseases, including viral infections. That then led to a second paper that I authored to kind of move this discussion forward, which was to ask, are there different immunotypes? Can we really talk about individuals based upon different status of their immune system and how that would then respond differently to the SARS-CoV-2 virus or any other type of infectious disorder? And what we're starting to see now is that to do the kinds of screening that is available for immune system differentiation, Dr. Vojdani will be talking about this in more detail, that we, for the first time now, are starting to actually kind of clear the fog and understand a little bit how to differentiate immune system types in individuals. So personalization of immune intervention can start to become a reality. So this concept of immunotyping and how that differs in the response to infections or to other agents that can encourage chronic illness, I think is becoming a major next step in the evolution of our system. And I think, again, we're very fortunate to have Aristo Vojdani as a world expert to help share some of his thoughts with us. And then the last article in this series that I authored talked about the long-haul COVID recovery period. And do we really think of recovery from an immune injury that's occurred as a consequence of a viral infection as needing immune support, or is it really immune rejuvenation? And I've tried very hard to get this term immune rejuvenation out into our language system, because the data that's coming out of these discoveries that are being made in immunology are suggesting that we can actually rejuvenate the immune system. We can reboot it. We can restore it back to a functional state of more naive immune function, getting rid of some of these injuries that are carried along either epigenetically or mutationally. And so immune support probably is not the best way of approaching this, because immune support, this general boosting of immune system function, really might be boosting things that are already compromised and could amplify pre-existing immune issues. And we really should be focusing on improving function at the molecular and the cellular level through reprogramming our immune system through intervention, and that's what we've called immunorejuvenation. So this concept of moving away from immune support to immune rejuvenation represents, I think, one of the threshold discoveries and opportunities that we have that's really been facilitated and amplified, I think, through this construct of the SARS-CoV-2 kind of intensive work that's undergone in the field of immunology over the last year or two. So if we look at what we're really talking about, we're talking about this interface of the immune system with various factors, one of which is this factor of injuries that the immune system has undergone that then become perpetuated. That's been associated with what's called immunosenescence, or aging of the immune system. And we now recognize that the immune system basically can age faster than our age and birthdays. It can also age slower than our age and birthdays. So this construct that we can modulate somehow the functional biological age or functionality of the immune system through intervention is a really important, I think, next step forward in how we're going to deal with this, what I call pig in a python, this extraordinary challenge that we're going to have coming up, and it's actually starting right now, called the long COVID syndrome. So if we look at how COVID as a condition relates to these conditions, we would see that this concept of immunosenescence is tied to aging of the immune system. So the question has been raised as, can you use senolytic drugs? Can you use therapeutic agents that can roll back the senescence of the immune system to, I think, rejuvenate an immune system that has undergone injury from a SARS-CoV-2 viral infection? And that was discussed at some length in this paper, that there are agents that are being discussed now that have the potential for that effect. That then leads to what I consider a very, very provocative and important study that was just published, and many of you may be familiar with this because its principal author is one of our own, coming from our personalized lifestyle medicine, functional medicine family, and that's Dr. Kara Fitzgerald and her colleague Ramley Hodges. And this wonderful collaborative work that they did, including work with Moshe Sev, looking at the ability to reverse epigenetic age with a diet and lifestyle intervention. And in this particular study, as you recall, they used DNA methylation of specific blood cells, particularly that related to immune system function. And this DNA age, this methylation age, was then able to be shown to be reversed in terms of its biologic age through an intensive diet and lifestyle intervention program. This was a fairly small size study, obviously. It was fairly short duration, only 8 weeks, but I think it shows some very, very important outcomes that are instructive for all of us as to the important role that lifestyle, diet, and nutrition intervention play in modulating immune system function that's undergone immunosenescence. They actually showed a 3.23 year decrease in biological age measured by the Horvath clock mechanism. And I think this is a very, very powerful indicator that there is therapeutic value in a personalized lifestyle functional medicine intervention program using a diet and nutrition therapy for people who have accelerated immunosenescence. So we've been seeing now that from this discussion that after COVID that prevention is being redefined to include these prognostic markers for immunological function. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from what we've learned this last year, that the immune system is kind of our sentinel system that's communicating with the outside world 24/7, 365. And if we can understand better its dynamics and how it gets modified and how it gets personalized into these immunotypes that I'm describing, it can improve our clinical precision and improve our patient outcome. So I think that we are very excited, even in the face of all the tragedy that's occurred this last year as a consequence of COVID-19. We're very encouraged that this breakthrough types of understanding of our immune system is leading us into new therapeutic approaches for intervention. So if you then ask, where are some of the places therapeutically that we should be placing our interest and our focus? I think we would say that one of the important things is obviously in the area of where the immune system resides at the gut level. The gut immune system, again, we seem always to come back to this, but the gut and other epithelial tissues, those like in the nose and throat, are those that have very important influences on infectivity and immune system function. And there are certain alterations in the microbiome of these mucosal cells, these mucosal tissues, that have generalized impact on cellular whole organism immunity. So we're really starting to talk about how do we improve mucosal immunity? How do we look at things like IgA, secretory IgA, and start to understand how to use different types of tools to understand the mucosal immunity of the individual, and then how to intervene to improve their functional mucosal immunity. And again, we will have some review of that with Dr. Vojdani and Dr. Ruan. So this intestinal microbial disruption definitely then influences both the innate immunity, the first line of defense, as well as the second line of defense, which is our adaptive immunity, and influences then the cell signaling molecules that are associated with these immune defensive networks, and then increases the lethality of viral infections and the seriousness of infections. So we really talk about enhancing both the first line of defense, the innate immune system, and the second line of defense, the adaptive immune system, and the interrelationship that they share through T cell activities through this lifestyle and diet and nutrition intervention. And it's interesting, if you look at kind of the covariables of alterations in mucosal health and infection, there's an interesting paper that was published in JAMA just recently in 2020 that looked at mortality risk through viral infection in individuals who had various forms of celiac disease, and showing that this kind of autoimmune mucosal disorder of the immune system was really correlated with increased severity of infection with respiratory viruses. So I think, again, we think of this as a network interconnection. We think of the fact that all these systems are interacting, and if we then move upstream to try to personalize our immune intervention to enhance immune function, the downstream effects cut across many different disease entities and risk, including risk to infection, to viral disorders. So that then leads us here to what about COVID-19 and the long haul syndrome. So we recognize, those of us that have been around in this field for a number of years, that what is going on right now with long COVID and how it's being treated and responded to by the medical community is reminiscent of what happened in the 1980s and early 1990s with the chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgia syndrome situation. And those of you who were around during this time, you recall that what happened was there was a very significant pushback by medicine that CFIDs really existed. And the reason I believe that it pushed back so strongly against it was that you could not find a single diagnostic indicator or pathogenic organism that you could clearly define as the causative agent, the etiological agent for chronic fatigue syndrome. And when you can't define the pathology clearly, then medicine becomes a little bit confused because it's so focused on single origin pathogenesis. And the systems biology concern that is associated with multiple factors is not so easily managed within the medical system that drives to a single diagnostic criteria for etiological causation. And so with regard to CFIDs, we've had this concept for many years that it was all in the mind and there was no organicity, and it was rejected just as a psychological dilemma. And people were just basically, it was what used to be called pejoratively a functional disorder, meaning a psychosomatic disorder. But over the last, particularly the last 10 years now, it's become more clear that CFIDs does in fact have an organicity. It is functional, but it's functional in terms of its biology as functional, not just all in the mind. And we now recognize that if you measure things like phosphorus-31 nuclear magnetic resonance in individuals with CFIDs, that you'll find that their mitochondrial function is compromised. You'll see that there are significant deficits in their bioenergetics. And so now it is seen as a cellular disorder that has a metabolic sequelae and series of influences. And it requires a different approach than a drug for a single origin disease. It requires a multifactorial approach. Well, I think that the same thing is starting to emerge around long COVID, because the conditions that people are experiencing now and the way they're expressing it is multiple in its phenotype and its phenopathology. It's also very complex in its different degrees of severity, frequency, and duration. So it is a very complicated condition, from fairly mild to very severe across multiple organs. And because it has no singular defined origin at this point or pathology, it's being said by some as just people are just having post-traumatic stress syndrome. It has no organic influence. But I think what we're starting to recognize is that it's more than just post-traumatic stress, that the correlation between chronic fatigue syndrome and post-traumatic stress is there, but there is something going on biologically that is very similar to what we saw with CFIDs, bioenergetic alterations in different tissues. The tissues may be different in different individuals with different organ effects. Then you have complex symptom profiles. And therefore, this is a disorder for systems biology. This is a disorder for the immune system to be looked at as part of a complex network of interacting variables. And it is therefore in the bailiwick of functional medicine and its training as it relates to approach towards a systems thinking. So when I looked at this recent paper in the Lancet on long COVID guidelines in physicians who have had long COVID, and they're reflecting their lived experience with it, it was very interesting of the variety of different things that they were describing that were influencing their function, such as myocarditis, microvascular angina, cardiac arrhythmias, dystonia, activation of mast cells, interstitial lung disease, thromboembolic disorders, myelopathies, renal impairment, newly onset diabetes and thyroiditis, hepatitis and abnormal liver enzymes, onset of allergies and anaphylaxis, and dysphonia. So you can see the range of different symptoms that people are experiencing that they call associated with this long COVID lived experience. So when we look at the post-COVID-19 syndrome incidence and risk factors, and this is a study done in countries in the Mediterranean, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, what they found is that this post-acute COVID-19 syndrome was detected in nearly half of the people who had experienced positive COVID disorders. And I think the most important thing for me in taking away from this literature is that you cannot really define exactly how long COVID is going to be seen in the patient based upon the severity of their COVID infection. There are people that had fairly mild symptoms of COVID infection or SARS-2 COVID infection who have then fairly serious long COVID syndromes, and other people who had more serious infection with SARS-CoV-2, but have fairly mild long COVID. So there's not a direct correlation between the degree of severity of your SARS-CoV-2 and the appearance of long COVID. So I think that what we see is this is a very, very important condition across multiple different organ systems. And this paper, I think, really shows the degree of different symptoms that one has across all these different areas. So this is a functional medicine disorder that's going to be well primed for personalized immunological intervention. So in conclusion, I'd say that new discoveries are opening an understanding of how the immune system responds to exposure to environmental, lifestyle, and dietary factors. Immune aging is associated with inflammation, which is this comorbidity that we've seen with COVID-19. intervention trials are now being published to demonstrate that our immune age can be reversed with personalized lifestyle medicine intervention. Long COVID is projected to influence up to 15% of COVID-positive patients. That would be in the United States alone, greater than 4 million patients that will be seeking out medical care. This is going to be as I said, a second wave of concerns. Long COVID will respond to like CFIDS was in the 1990s. And I think this concept of shared medical visits and the virtual functional medicine intervention, including cognitive behavioral components, will represent significant opportunities for managing this extraordinary concern of patients that are suffering from long COVID.
All right, welcome back. Wasn't that awesome? Always think that Dr. Bland sets it up well, and a super empowering vision of how medicine can be reinvented. Let's get back to our next speaker now. Next is Dr. Aristo Vojdani. He's sort of the godfather of functional immunology. And last year on the Functional Forum, on the PLMI session, he actually shared this, which I feel like was maybe the most prescient guide of the whole year. You know, still to this day in conventional medicine, they will tell you they don't really know. Why do some people get a really bad result with COVID-19, and why do some people have almost no reaction to it? Well, it's based on their function. You can see he shared that factors relating to the exposome and toxins, mucosal immunity, leaky gut, and then the function of your neutralizing antibodies, viral receptors, innate immune response, and anti-inflammatory cytokines all play a role in determining how bad the infection is. So this year, Dr. Vojdani got into some of the core information in not just like how COVID affects the immune system, but he also started to touch on a little bit about autoimmunity and spike proteins, which I think we're going to hear a lot more about over the coming months and years. So here is some of the best bits from Dr. Aristo Vojdani.
About a year ago, we asked many questions. But one of the most valid questions was, why do many people get exposed to SARS-CoV-2 and some people do not get infected? Some get a mild infection and some get a serious infection. And unfortunately, as we know, some even died from the infection. At that time, with the kind of knowledge we had, we tried to answer those questions. This is one of the slides I borrowed from my last year's presentation. Of course, our genome, our exposome, plays a significant role. Our mucosal immune system, because that's the route of entry of the virus. Neutralizing antibodies. Now we know that neutralizing antibodies could be even from other viruses. An individual, if had in the past flu virus and having antibodies against that virus, those antibodies, due to cross-reactivity, can protect against SARS-CoV-2. And finally, the cellular receptors that we know that are important, and the immune system. If I will summarize the innate and adaptive immune response, the cytokines, all of that together, in one word, that will be our immunome. And the answer to that question from last year will be the difference in our immunome. And that is because the immune system in people is as diverse as height, beauty, intelligence, and other human features. So our genome, our lifestyle, our exposome affect our immune system, our immunotype. And that's why I'm going to talk a little bit about how to measure our immunotype, because this is going to be the heart of the matter in the future, how to treat different patients with different immunotypes. So the method that is used, called flow cytometry, So immunophenotyping is quantification by flow cytometry of an individual's lymphocyte subsets into an identifiable pattern. So each one of us have and will have different pattern of the immune system. So during past 20 years, or even years before that, we have done many testing using flow cytometry with available methodologies. And at that time, we could divide individuals to two groups. First of all, three. One, healthy. The two abnormals, either they were immune suppressed, they had immune deficiency, or hyperactive immune system, or autoimmune, possible autoimmune reactivity. But now, as Dr. Bland mentioned, the article by Dr. Matthews in Science talked about different immunotypes in COVID patients. And this is the article. As you can see, so many authors participated. The article is not easy to understand, even for an immunologist like me. So what they found that a subgroup of patients had T-cell activation characteristics of acute viral infection and plasmablast responses reaching greater than 30% of circulating B cells, meaning greater than 30% of the cells became so activated, they are producing antibody against COVID, but may produce also antibodies against different components of our tissue that you'll see later on. Another subgroup had lymphocyte activation comparable to uninfected subjects. But I read this again and again. And this is, in order to simplify this, just let's look at CD4 or helper cells. What they found that 50% of patients with COVID had overactive CD4 cells. 30% had decreased or underactive CD4 cells, and 20% no change. Let's look at CD8. 25% increase, and CD8 many used to call it suppressor cells. Now it's called the cytotoxic lymphocyte, because one of its job is to kill viral infected cells. So CD8 cell is protecting us against viruses. 25% increased, 10% decreased, and 65% no change. The question that I'm raising in here, and it was also discussed by Dr. Bland, can we treat these three subgroups? Let's just talk about CD4 cells with the same medication. If the patient is having decreased CD4 cells, can we put that patient on dexamethasone and remdesivir, which was or is the treatment of choice? And this is where personalized medicine is coming and helping. So the answer is yes, absolutely no. The overactive individuals should be treated differently from those with decreased CD4 cells, and the same thing is applied to other different lymphocytes. Furthermore, in another study that you can see in here, they studied 340 confirmed COVID-19 patients. At the time of hospitalization, and they looked at limited T cell subsets. What they found that 310 of them who had relatively normal immune system, they overcame the disease and were discharged from the hospital after a few days. But unfortunately, the 30 who had very abnormal immune system, they did not have enough soldiers to fight for them. They did not make it and did not survive the disease. So the conclusion of this fascinating article was that patients with a less damaged immune system at the time of hospitalization had higher chance of recovery. So here, the limited lymphocyte subpopulation, those who were discharged, you can see they have much higher numbers. Please do not look at percentages. That doesn't mean anything. Okay, so the absolute numbers, meaning how many soldiers we have in our body for each type of lymphocyte to fight. 773 versus 228 T cell count. Helper cells, 457 versus 139. That's why individuals who did not have enough soldiers to fight for them did not survive the disease.
All right, so I know we all learned a lot from that. Next up is Dr. Cheng Ruan. He is a clinical innovator. I'm super excited to bring him on. I featured him in my book, The Community Cure, because I think what Dr. Ruan has built in his clinic is a really interesting vision for decentralized community care. People working with each other through a virtual visit model, and also being able to do it from their own homes. And so in this session, he talked just a little bit about some of what he's done in the clinic, some of the big things that have come up inside the payer system. Dr. Ruan is intimately connected with an accountable care organization and keeps great track of all of the data in his practice. And that is putting him in conversations with AMA, CMS, and the organizations that are trying to think about how health coaching will make it into the payer system. And so there's about 10 minutes here of Dr. Ruan's presentation that is super valuable to any practitioner. Enjoy.
The switch to telehealth was very daunting because even though there was a release of liability for us not to use necessarily HIPAA compliant platforms, we still wanted to be HIPAA compliant. So Zoom came out with their HIPAA compliant platform just before they got hacked, actually. So we started using that, and we started using some other platforms, and we just wanted to have a little trial to see what was the best. And we noticed that a lot of people who we were accessing for in rural areas and people who can't come to the clinic or don't want to come to the clinic, they enjoy these telehealth platforms. And it used to be that if you're age over 65, a lot of patients don't like to come to the practice. Or sorry, they like to come to the practice. They don't like telehealth because of tech issues. But with COVID-19, that really changed. That did a 180, and people were very appreciative that we were able to do a video and phone conference. So one of the other changes to CMS and coding is that we were able to bill our regular doctor's visits code, E&M codes, with a patient at their own house with just a telephone call. So now there's these telephone call codes. If a patient texts you, now they're texting and secure messaging codes that are there. And so the acceleration of the communication platform and assigning it into the CPT codes was already in development for years. And they started that process. They started to pay for it in 2019. 2020, they took away restrictions. In 2021, all those are modified into permanent codes now. So we now have permanent reimbursable codes for different types of communication, text message, phone calls, provider visits, in terms of video and phone conference and whatnot. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is, before coronavirus hit, we were already in development for this platform for about a year. We actually wanted to do online courses, which is now fully functional. So if you go to www.tclmuniversity.com, which stands for Texas Center for Lifestyle Medicine University.com, you can actually see some of our online courses. There's cancer support, there's brain train master workshops. So a lot of it is integrative health and functional medicine concepts that we wanted to get people involved in. And the development of this took a lot of effort and took a lot of time for our staff. But we were about 95% of the way done when COVID hit, and we really accelerated to finish that last 5%. The last 5% always takes forever. And we were able to get conversations started. In fact, Dr. Bland, you're actually in one of the workshops for COVID. And so when this started, we were able to collect a lot of data because we put questionnaires into these online courses, and people were able to kind of go on your own. And we started incorporating the education here into our visits and sort of assigning a go at your own pace for a lot of patients. And what it really did was create a much higher level of conversation. People were able to take on a lot more for themselves once they have the education. And also it's a two-way communication. So within the platform, there's ways of communicating with us, commenting and messaging so patients were knowing what they really need from us, and we know what they were asking for. So subsequent online courses were dedicated to that. And from our online university, we were able to generate what's called these group visits. So we did group visits, and we used the platform from the Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center to document it. And these group visits went from in-person visits. All of a sudden, we were able to do virtual visits. And these were health coach-led programs, so functional medicine health coach-led programs. And they're supported by the physicians and providers. And we're focusing a lot on virtual mental health services. So the picture here is Jenny Moreno. She's a mind-body medicine practitioner and a functional medicine coach. And that was her group Tai Chi programs. And we were focusing a lot on brain health, and we were looking at things that we were doing for brain health during the pandemic. And we ended up in Forbes talking about CBD and brain health and before and after clinical trials we were doing with the National Football League. And then we talked about treating and monitoring education on COVID-19. So Coronavirus Defense Builder is one of our online courses, and we were able to ask people what they wanted, gather the information, and design virtual group visits based on what they were requesting. So, backed by popular demand, this is going to be Dr. Ron talking about, vaccines and the comparisons between them and sort of educating them. And we were able to monitor patients using some technology, remote patient monitoring. So we were to monitor their vitals and saturations. And all that data goes into our online platform where our health coaches actually run the entire system. And we were able to do free public education campaigns on social media until I got censored. So, the first video got censored is myself and Dr. Mark Hyman here talking about what we should eat during COVID-19. Apparently, we broke some community guidelines on Facebook, and actually had my account shut down. So it's a bit of a shame, but that was back in April as well. But what I've learned since multiple media censorships is that if we deliver the information within our own practice to our own patients, we're fine. But if we do it publicly, we have to have some sort of avoiding the censorship that was just didn't sit very well with me, because we're actually delivering valuable information and lifestyle medicine based to the public. Now, fast forward, we're in 2021. All the stuff we talked about, and James Maskell was there too, all the stuff that we talked about back in March and April on these videos are what's now the standard of care. So we're talking about the things that we should eat, vitamin D, sunshine, all that stuff like that. All the original videos got censored, but right now, I think that there's more leniency in what could be said, and there's more adaptation of what's really considered important in COVID-19. So I'm happy to say that the censorship is not as crazy as it was before, but it existed there in the first place. And then public distrust. There's a massive distrust. I mean, there was racial wars, cancel culture, Black Lives Matter movements, and all this stuff really happened last year. And whenever we try to say something in public, there's a level of scrutiny that's there, and it's very charged. But I believe that if we all as practitioners come together and just deliver value to our community, no matter what happens, and continue delivering the value, we can really gain a lot of trust. And I think the lifestyle medicine, functional medicine community is able to do that far better than more conventional practices. So we continue to deliver that and sort of embrace each other, we won't be as divided. And I've really noticed that the functional medicine community, the integrative health community over the last year has been very, very divided over topics surrounding coronavirus, surrounding the election politics. And I think that we should all just kind of go back and give each other hugs and come back together, because we can only fight distrust by having a unified view and respecting each other's opinions. And then, of course, there's vaccine wars, which is basically the most questioned item in the chat box during Dr. Vajdani's talk. But we were able to do group visits for discussing the different types of vaccines and how it can help people individually, and that really helped as well. And then also, for the first time ever, 2021, there's new CPT and E&M guidelines, which is really helping us out in the integrative health space. Once again, I'm going to go into much more detail on this. I know everyone on this summit doesn't necessarily take insurance, so I'm not going to spend too much on this. But for the first time, doctors can be reimbursed for extended time with patients, talking to their family members now at a higher level of care. That's never happened before. Talking to other doctors is now available without the patient there. Texting, messaging, email, like I said before, and taking out the ever-dreaded review of systems was the most fabulous thing in reimbursement history. And then billing for phone calls. And then also having health coaches on your staff is far more productive now, because there's reimbursable structures for that. And doing online group visits, I think, is just a big game changer.
Okay, and the last presentation is from myself. I was super grateful last year just to be able to share something about the sort of practice management part that we delivered in our Practice Accelerator. This time last year, we actually launched the virtual practice pivot guide for all the doctors that were looking to add a virtual component to their practice. And this year, I really wanted to take some time to think about, look, if we're going to talk about the reinvention of medicine, how do we do it? And why has it not happened yet? Because clinically, it seems like there's every reason in the world for the reinvention to have occurred, but we haven't got there. And the key concept that I talk about here is this idea of friction. And if we really want to invent medicine, we need to take the friction out of the transformation medicine. And that's at the patient level, the doctor level, and at the systemic level. I hope that wherever you are, whatever type of practice you run, whether you are inside the insurance system or whether you're a cash practice, if you're in America or if you're in anywhere else around the world, actually after this conversation, I had so many people get in touch from different countries around the world, which is really amazing to see just the reach that PLMI and our education is having. So without further ado, here is the final segment for tonight, reducing friction for the reinvention of medicine. Enjoy. So I'm very excited today to talk about reducing the friction to the reinvention of medicine. I mean, last year, this was the most prescient conversation of the year. Some of those slides from Dr. Vojdani last year, absolutely critical to understand for any doctor, not just doctors in functional medicine, but for any doctor. And ultimately, this year, our theme last year was all about resilience, because last year we had to be resilient. But this year, we got to reinvent medicine pretty fast, because conventional medicine has shown to be super inadequate for, what we need right now. And I'm sure I'm sort of in a certain way preaching to the converted here, but ultimately I'm sure all of us are frustrated that this reinvention of medicine is not happening quickly enough to meet the needs.
And ultimately, what I want to talk about today is how we can reduce the friction to get to that reinvention of medicine. And honestly, that the meetups is a part of it, but it's not the whole piece. So, last year, 2 months before COVID came out, I brought out a book, and it talked about everyone getting in rooms together and doing group visits. So, we really had to think on our feet. If you guys haven't listened to the book, I'm making it free, available. You can see the link at the bottom, thecommunitycure.com/audiobook. You can download the MP3 and listen to it. But in that book, in the last chapter, I talked about my thesis for the reinvention, which is based on this naturopathic therapeutic order, which essentially all it postulates is that we should use the lowest cost, least invasive interventions first, and then work our way up. Now, in medicine right now, we go with the high force interventions like surgery and drugs first, and ultimately that's leading to a financial, with the exponential increase in costs and an exponential increase in harm. And so ultimately, I really think that we've got a lot to learn from the naturopathic therapeutic order. Ultimately starting with identifying and removing obstacles to cure, the social determinants of health. You'll hear a lot of that conversation around in medicine at the moment. We want to stimulate self-healing mechanisms. We want to support weakened systems, and we'll talk about how we can do that. So, this is being backed up now by some of this literature that's coming out. Dr. Bland mentioned it was a huge moment for functional medicine 2 years ago, actually almost 2 years ago, to see much better outcomes for functional medicine with chronic disease at the Cleveland Clinic. And then just a couple of weeks ago now, seeing that in the follow-up content from the Cleveland Clinic, that not only are outcomes better in group-delivered functional medicine, but that the cost is also significantly lower. And that reinforces sort of like my version of the naturopathic therapeutic order from the book, which was essentially that empowerment, the delivery of modalities to stimulate the self-healing mechanisms, and nutrition could all be done in these groups. And if they were done in groups, we would now have an efficient enough delivery system to have lifestyle functional medicine, personalized lifestyle medicine, delivered at a big enough scale. And ultimately, there's also, you see there, functional medicine, fifth one up. For those doctors who are listening to Dr. Vojdani and Dr. Bland and super in the minutiae of reversing chronic disease, the sort of precision medicine end of functional medicine, there's a place for them too. But ultimately, if we can do these groups right and deliver that to everyone, then we have a chance of really flattening the curve of healthcare costs and creating significant health and self-efficacy across the population. And so last year is when we launched our virtual practice pivot guide. You can still get it because ultimately we needed to get people up and running. And in that presentation, I talked about the power of virtual group visits. And you've heard Cheng talk about it there and how he's been using it. I think there's a great opportunity. And we've, even got whole companies like Fullscript on board to be able to support group visits with like group prescribing, through group visits. But ultimately, the question I have to ask you is like, what's slowing us down, right? Why hasn't this become the standard of care? Could there be any more obvious circumstances have come along to prove that the medical system is not fit for purpose, that we have no idea how to deal effectively with chronic disease? And when I'm saying this, I'm talking about this big blue ocean of medicine that's not functional medicine, right? I'm talking about everything else in medicine. And ultimately, how can, why is it so slow to adapt? And the answer is friction, right? There's a ton of friction in the system. Now, you could think of friction as the resistance that something encounters when moving over, when something moves over another. That's one definition of friction. But I think Cheng talked about another definition of friction, which is conflict or animosity caused by a clash of wills, temperaments, or opinions. And we've got a lot of friction in the system, and it's really stopping us adapting to this new environment. So let's talk about where's this friction coming from, right? Think about from the patient perspective, from the user of medicine, what friction is there to actually getting healthy, having a strong immune system so that we can fight off COVID and whatever else comes down the road. we have an unbelievably unhealthy environment, right? We live in the most unhealthy environment ever, probably, and getting more and more unhealthy. I saw a study recently saying that, male sperm count was going to reach 0 by 2045 if we keep going the same way. I had a daughter 2 months ago. In 2045, she's going to be 24 and wanting to reproduce. Will I be able to have grandchildren, right? That's a pretty big question for me. This is going to happen in our lifetime, folks. So this conversation about friction couldn't be more important. You've got behavior change is hard, right? Behavior change is hard, especially in an unhealthy environment. Adherence to protocol is hard. There's this huge education gap, right? Patients and people don't know how their body works, right? This could be in like junior high education. They don't really understand how to avoid chronic disease. Obviously, poverty and inequality, we've heard a lot about that in the last year, the social determinants of health, really determining people's, health outcomes, the zip code being more important than your genetic code. So we've heard a lot about that. Access, right? Access to care certainly is a big issue for a lot of people. Isolated, like if chronic disease, if the biggest driver of chronic disease is isolation, we just got a hell of a lot more isolated in the last year, right? Everyone in their homes. We also got to think about payer priorities, right? Insurance priorities, pharmaceutical marketing. All of these things, like you have pharmaceutical marketing here on TV, it really affects people's, ideas about what they should be doing for their health and, the news cycle. So there's a lot of friction for patients. But, there's also a lot of friction for doctors, right? So some patients get it. There's been a ton of books that have come out and patients have really started to understand, okay, and that's led people to start to take action. You've seen the biohacking movement, people starting to move forward ahead of the medical system. But there's also a ton of doctor friction. Think about how much friction you had to overcome to make your way into personalized lifestyle medicine or functional medicine. There's the medical training, the sunk costs, right? I don't know if you've heard of the sunk cost fallacy, but ultimately people think, well, I just spent this much time learning, conventional medicine. I'm not going to go and learn another type of medicine, right? There's the paradigm reinforcement through education and so forth. There's the evidence gap. Really, that evidence from the Cleveland Clinic was really the first time showing that not parts of the functional medicine operating system, like sleep and nutrition and so forth, but the whole thing, it was really the first evidence to show that it was working, because for the first time, outcomes were being tracked meticulously. So now we're starting to see more and more evidence. It takes a little bit of humility to practice differently. I'm sure all of you guys have had to see that. Clinical education, learning a new paradigm. And then let's talk about some big things like entrepreneurship, right? Up until a few years ago, if you wanted to practice this new way, you had to become an entrepreneur. And that's probably like a nightmare for most doctors to think about the fact that they had to do their own marketing and build a new business model and build new systems, because delivering a lifestyle first approach to medicine is very different than just handing out prescriptions every 7 minutes. You have to build new systems, never mind like hiring provider teams and human resources and adopting technology. So there's a ton of doctor friction too. So it's not just patient friction, but there's a ton of doctor friction. And again, why isn't every doctor in America, hot on vitamin D right now and prescribing it and using it and learning about it? Like, that can only really be described in my mind as this friction of all of the things that you see here. And then you have medical system friction too, not just the doctors themselves, but the insurance system, medical education, tradition, right? Just doing it the same as we've always done it. I love Max Planck's quote that science evolves one funeral at a time. It's true. Like, it's so slow because, the powers that be have to kind of die off before a new model can emerge. Evidence, outcomes, as I mentioned before, misaligned incentives are an issue too. And so there's just huge opportunity costs that live inside the medical system so that we don't change quickly enough. And when I was looking back really to see what is the evolution of medicine really? What have we done? We've built these meetup groups, but what have we done over the last few years? We've tried everything that we've proposed or recommended or helped doctors implement has all been about reducing friction. Right. So your positioning of your practice, right? People don't think most doctors, most patients don't think that there's some doctor out there that can reverse such a range of chronic illnesses. So oftentimes positioning is important to help patients realize that you're the one for them. Education, Dr. Ruan was saying, like his education systems to educate prospective new patients so that they understand that they are empowered and that they can participate. This helps reduce friction so that patients can come into the practice. Marketing automation. This is one of probably the most important thing that any clinic can organize is marketing automation so that people go through education in an automated way and it's not just you talking one-on-one. Technology reduces friction if used in the right way. Coaching, right? We're seeing a huge growth in coaching. Dr. Ruan's using coaching in his practice because, coaching, I heard a great definition of coaching the other day. Coaching is helping people take action in light of their own intentions. How many people out there have intentions to be healthy but just can't execute on it because, they're not able to really take ideas to action? And that's why coaching can be really valuable. Groups certainly reduce friction. And I talked about that a lot in my book as far as like helping people be accountable. If you look at the ways in which we have facilitated behavior change in society, if you look at Alcoholics Anonymous, if you look at all, these different systems, it's all been about groups of people starting to hold people accountable. And that's really the theme of the book, The Community Cure. Mentorship can really reduce friction. And so you've seen just this second generation of functional medicine. Now there are mentors out there in all areas of practice development, clinical mentoring, making it easy for the next functional medicine doctor or doctors to make it into functional medicine and start practicing in this personalized, lifestyle-driven way. Certainly there are guides and tools. You see the Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center that Cheng mentioned. One of the reasons why we ended up partnering with them around the book was because they had created these group visit toolkits that made it easier for you to do that. And I want to talk a little bit later here about outsourcing, because I think for the first time ever, there are now ways to outsource some of the things that have been like annoying or boring or unsexy with practicing this type of medicine. But ultimately, like if I look at all of these things here, this is pretty much an overview of what we've been talking about for 7 years at the Evolution of Medicine, is trying to reduce friction to make it easier for patients to come into your practice and to get themselves well, and for you to deliver it in a way that makes it most palatable, to most people. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed tonight's Functional Forum. Super excited to share these bits for you. And I hope you learned something wherever you are in the world or whatever type of practice you have. I'm excited again just to remind you that in the next month, we are going to be showcasing our community reinvention of medicine in Austin, Texas, starting on the 25th of May. This is going to be live on the 25th of May in person in Texas. We're going to video it, and then we're going to send it out as the Functional Forum on the 7th of June. So whether you're in Austin or anywhere else around the world, we look forward to having you join us. Thanks so much for being part of the Functional Forum. We will see you next month. Thanks so much for joining us, and enjoy.